Good morning, all. Thanks for joining this panel about the blue economy under threat and how federal, local, and private industry partnerships are working to achieve coastal resilience around the country. If the U.S. coastal counties along our nation were an individual country, that country would rank third in the world in gross domestic product. Our coastal counties produce more than $8.3 trillion in goods and services. They employ 56 million people and pay $3.4 trillion in wages. This engine of American prosperity is being placed under unprecedented stress from the impacts of extreme weather and sea level rise. If not properly addressed, these threats can undermine our national security and our economic security. My name is Mark Osler. I have the pleasure of working at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, which is an agency inside the U.S. Department of Commerce. I serve NOAA as Senior Advisor on Coastal Inundation and Resilience. I'm pleased to be joined this morning by Dr. Brian Batten from Dewberry and also from Sue Kriebel from the City of Virginia Beach. We'll spend the next 40 minutes together with you, bringing together a story from the front lines of our nation's challenges along the coast and how our communities are dealing with impacts of climate change and how the federal, private, and local governments are working together to meet those challenges. Here's just a quick snapshot of how our coastal states, counties, and communities are an economic engine across the United States. These communities, through marine commerce, tourism, extractive resources, are powering the economy and providing jobs and GDP, as noted. These communities are also under threat. They face the dual challenges of high impact events like hurricanes, as well as chronic stresses from sea level rise. Rising sea level means that floodwaters move further inland. They cause more severe erosion on our beaches. They destroy more infrastructure, loss of habitat, and loss of homes, and putting more people out of work and on the move. These impacts affect millions of people. And of course, the impacts themselves are disproportionately felt by those most vulnerable among us. Our colleagues and community members who have the least agency to reduce their risk and often no financial or social safety net are indeed the most vulnerable to these climate change impacts. So the essential question then is, how can we create better outcomes? How can we not stop sea level rise, but help communities adapt and become more resilient? They'll need help with financing. They'll need help with insurance. They'll need help with sound building codes, land use planning, emergency management, you name it, these communities will need help with it. And to obtain that kind of help and to raise knowledge and capacity on the ground, it is foundational that we must understand risk. Understanding risk requires that you have baseline measurements on how things have been going and some skill at understanding on questions like what might happen next, how frequently might that happen, how confident are we in our projections, and critically, what might our future look like if we don't take any action now. Understanding these risks requires authoritative data in the location you need it and focused on the questions that matter most. Armed with these data, our communities can start to understand risk, incentivize better decisions earlier, and start to walk forward into a more resilient future. The story that we'll share with you today is one of those stories in a journey towards resilience, a journey that highlights the powerful connection between the federal investment in authoritative science, the private industry expertise, and the vision of a community galvanized by the challenge of creating a more resilient future for themselves. I'm going to start telling the story with a brief overview of NOAA's mission and describe some of our key work with respect to coastal resilience. Following that NOAA overview, you'll hear from the City of Virginia Beach about some of the challenges they are facing with respect to sea level rise and flooding impacts, and then from private industry and how they play a key role in understanding and aggregating those federal resources and insights, and then pivoting to deliver them at the local level for specific challenges and specific outcomes on the ground. So NOAA's mission is simple. It's science, service, and stewardship. From the surface of the sun to the depths of the ocean, we have a responsibility and a mission to the American people to understand our changing climate, our changing weather, our atmosphere, our oceans, and the human and ecological systems which rely on those changes. And critically, NOAA is unique in having a mission to translate and communicate these insights to the public on behalf of the public. Very quickly, with respect to coastal resilience, I want to touch in three areas: observations and data, tools and analytics, and then the outreach and training. So for observations and data, these are ideas where NOAA is busy measuring our oceans, measuring our atmosphere, our weather, and our coasts. Critical to this discussion of coastal resilience are questions of coastal water levels. On the right here is a picture of one of our tide gauge stations. This is one of the hardened ones that can survive a Cat 5 hurricane. These basic measurements of coastal water levels we are taking authoritatively and repeatedly every 6 minutes at more than 200 locations across the country. These measurements critically support safe marine commerce as shipping vessels come in and out of our nation's ports, as well as supporting all sorts of environmental monitoring and modeling that goes on. And for this particular story, questions of sea level rise are foremost. NOAA's tide gauge network is the foundational backbone for the nation on measuring and understanding the rate of change for sea level rise and how that differs in different locations across the country. We also similarly measure rainfall. In addition to predicting rainfall, we support and create the National Spatial Reference System, which is something that most people don't spend a lot of time thinking of, but it is the GPS-based system that allows GPS receivers, whether you're measuring the top of a wall or the corner of a building or the center line of a road or the height of a coastal water level, it is that spatial reference system that allows all of those measurements to relate to one another and understand that if you're making a measurement in one place and then a similar measurement 2 miles away, that you really can compare those two and that they are related to one another and are not just different because they were in different locations. We also manage the U.S. Integrated Ocean Observing System. We provide the authoritative shoreline mapping for the country, and we also map and control, keep control over vertical land motion, which again, for issues of coastal resilience, often vertical land motion is a first-order contributor, contributing as much, in some cases even more, than changes in global mean sea level to changes in coastal risk. So all of these data are part and parcel of a pantheon of foundational observations that NOAA makes on behalf of the U.S. public. All of it is freely available, able to be ingested by private industry for use and value-added applications. In addition to the data itself, NOAA administers a host of tools and analytics. There are efforts to analyze and seek knowledge from those data. The data themselves don't tell us anything. What it takes is a trained practitioner to look at trends, to analyze them and understand what are they telling us and how might that be changing over time. And so key again to this discussion is publication of sea level trends, which we do across the country. Atlas 14 is parlance for understanding recurrence intervals and the likelihood of different rainfall intensities in different parts of the country. And so between water levels and Atlas 14, you have coastal water levels and you have rainfall, together with data from the USGS and NOAA on land elevation, and from USGS and NOAA on riverine flooding. You have the land and you have the water, and you have now how those pieces are changing. Having authoritative, publicly funded sources for that information guarantees that the U.S. public will have access to the key data sets that are required to make sense of how environmental change is likely to impact folks on the ground. On the right here is a picture from NOAA's Flood Exposure Mapper, which is a GIS tool that's available through our Digital Coast platform that helps overlay different approximations of flood risk with questions of societal interest like poverty, land use cover, different ages of communities. So we start to understand not just risk, but vulnerability. What is at risk? And how might that help inform better decision making on the ground? We provide coastal economic county snapshots. Any county in the US, you can go on Digital Coast and look up an economic snapshot of what is your piece of the blue economy and how is it made up and how are coastal interests impacting the bottom line for your local chamber of commerce and your local politicians. And then lastly, part of this suite of tools and analytics is NOAA provides a high tide outlook and has done for the last couple of years. High tide flooding is a term we'll circle back to in a minute. But the idea is that a community is suffering a flooding impact from the coast when there's not a storm going on. It's a sunny day. It's a high tide, highest tide of the month perhaps, or of the season. And we are across the U.S., particularly the U.S. and East and Gulf Coast, increasingly seeing instances of high tide flooding where things that used to be dry are no longer dry on a regular basis. Just yesterday, NOAA released the 2019 high tide flooding outlook, or flooding recap, and the 2020 look forward for the flooding outlook. And the rate of high tide flooding has more than doubled across the United States in the last 2 decades and is projected to increase. If you're using all the tools of this conference, I've put in a link in my speaker profile to that high tide flooding outlook page if you wanted to go explore that. And then lastly, I wanted to touch on grants and training. In addition to the foundational data and the analytics and modeling of the science to make sense of that, NOAA also critically carries a mission to fund work out in the public, to push monies out through grant programs to the public, as well as to use our own staff and resources to build local capacity to engage with these data, to understand them, and start to marry those scientific insights critically with local thoughts on what are the challenges, what are the priorities of local communities in relation to your local history, your culture, and the future that the community is headed in together. Those types of applications are not possible at the federal level and not proper for the federal government to undertake. But we do pick up and carry our information into the local communities so that folks have the education and understanding to grapple with these challenges on their own terms. And so on the grants and training, I've mentioned a few up here on the slide. Critically, NOAA in the last 5 years has pushed out more than $180 million worth of coastal resilience funding. Almost 3/4 of that in the past, I believe, 3 years through the National Coastal Resilience Fund, which NOAA co-administers with the National Fish and Wildlife Federation, which is a tremendous opportunity to leverage both federal and private dollars to fund resilience work out on the ground. And so real quick, zooming in from the national to the local, we're about to hear a story from Virginia Beach about their challenges. Here's some of the NOAA data just to share with you, looking at measured and predicted days of high tide flooding in this part of the country. And you can see from the graph below, so that's not a sea level rise graph, that is a graph of days of high tide flooding, which of course is driven by sea level rise. But while sea level rise itself can be flat and sometimes increasing, you can see that the increase in days in high tide flooding is starting to take on an acceleration in and of itself. And as we look to projections in 20 and 30 years, things that may be nuisance flooding or happening once a month are likely to be happening as much as 3 or 4 times a month in the future. And so communities across the U.S., again, particularly in the East and Gulf Coast, are dealing with these challenges. And so what we brought you here today is a story of what those challenges look like on the front line. And so I will invite now Sue Kriebel with the City of Virginia Beach to start to set the stage for how these realities look for Virginia Beach, what the challenges have felt like, and how they have started to work into the effort to address them.
All right, are y'all seeing the correct view?
Yes, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Mark. This morning, Dr. Brian Batten from Dewberry and myself will present on how the City of Virginia Beach is using sea level wise adaptation strategy report to determine the cost of flooding. At risk is the city's economy, but the City Council and the citizens support the resiliency effort to protect the financial infrastructure by investing in the city. Next slide. The City of Virginia Beach was established in 1963. There are 310 square miles and 38 miles of shoreline along the Atlantic Ocean and Chesapeake Bay. The strong economy is supported by a large military presence and agriculture in the southern part of the city. We have over 19 million visitors every year, which provide the city $5.6 billion in retail sales yearly. Next slide. And although the city is mainly known as a resort city with a beautiful oceanfront and sandy beaches, it is also an agricultural community containing over 28,000 acres or nearly 44 square miles of farmland. Agriculture provided the city with approximately $136 million in 2018. The city has several state parks like False Cape and First Landing and marinas like the one shown in the upper left. It is an urban community with a vibrant mixed-use town center that is considered the downtown of Virginia Beach. Next slide. With the average elevation in Virginia Beach at 10 feet, you can imagine we receive a few flood complaints from time to time. So the city has taken a hard look at what needs to be updated, changed, or fixed to try to prevent the major flooding occurring within the city, which affects the economy. Previously, when an issue was brought to our attention, we would fix that, each one of them one at a time. But after 4 major storms in 2016, the city has decided to look at flooding at the holistic level. Next slide. Every city has the need to borrow money from time to time in order to improve its infrastructure and services. In order to borrow money at the lowest rates, cities must maintain a high credit score, much like one of us trying to get a car loan. Credit rating agencies such as Moody's Investors Services have incorporated climate change questions into their credit ratings for state and local bonds. If cities can't answer these questions shown on the screen, it can negatively impact their ability to borrow money. The Moody's questionnaire was sent to Virginia Beach in 2015. Luckily, we were able to provide robust answers to all of these questions. Moody's in December of 2018 announced that it would begin evaluating how cities can handle climate change risks in their credit ratings. The S&P is also doing this. Next slide. In order to protect the economy and the future of the city, City Council provided a CIP funding in 2014 to 2015 for 2 major studies. One is the Sea Level Rise study, which was completed in March this year, and the other is the Master Drainage study, which is still ongoing. So how are these 2 studies related? Sea level rise, increased rainfall, and coastal surge have brought these studies together. The boundary conditions for the sea level rise study are being used to inform the model, and then the model conditions are being used to help inform the sea level rise. The cost of the sea level rise study was $4 million, and the cost of the master drainage study is $12 million. Next slide. So Brian is now going to talk to you about tackling the challenge.
All right, thanks, Sue. So Dewberry came on board with the City of Virginia Beach in 2015 to help them break apart the challenge of how to recognize what the future would bring in terms of increased coastal flooding and how to develop a set of strategies to address that. For a little background on Dewberry, we're a national, privately held, full-service architecture, engineering, consulting, and geospatial firm. To do this kind of work, we have a long history, over 40 years, of working with natural hazards in terms of modeling them, mapping, working on mitigation, going out post-disasters to understand how it affected the built environment, and then working on recovery efforts to help those communities rebuild in a better way. We leveraged this experience over 10 years ago to start a climate resilience practice, and since then have had the opportunity to work on numerous federal, state, and local studies, such as Virginia Beach. For a complex study such as this, it truly takes an army of individuals. And here, across our company, we brought over 150 professionals, over 14 different service lines, with 12 PhDs contributing to the solution, along with several subcontractors providing niche services. And I definitely want to recognize their contributions today, just as I have the privilege of speaking to you about what we have done. When we sat down with the city initially in 2015, we worked to establish what the goal for the study should be and the preferred outcomes. The goal is stated here, but a simpler way of stating it is to ensure the vibrant future of Virginia Beach. And that is as a prime coastal resort community, their economy, and the quality of life of their citizens. To do that, we want to understand what future sea level rise will bring in terms of risks and impacts to the city, and then create a host of strategies to address those. And as Sue showed some of the diversity of the city earlier, we have to break those strategies out into specific parts of the city to really truly create an effective solution. And as we do that, we want to make sure we partner with the public to inform them and engage them and have buy-on on the path forward. As we work on studies like this for any given community or entity, it's really the federal investment in data and tools that make it, give us the ability to do what we can do. Here is kind of a laundry list across several federal agencies of items we leveraged to help us accomplish what we did for Virginia Beach. We, of course, gave NOAA the longest list today since we're speaking with them. But truly everything from the water level data that Mark mentioned earlier to flood hazard modeling data from FEMA, topography and elevation information from USGS, and many tools from the Corps of Engineers give us the ability to do what we can do. As we work to address the problem in Virginia Beach, it's truly complex and it takes a long time. In this case, it took about 5 years to work through these 4 phases, really the first 3 phases that we're showing here. Now, the core of the effort starts in the beginning. We have to lay the foundation in phase 1. And this is where we leverage a host of data developed by NOAA and other federal agencies to really understand the water hazard conditions of today, and then look to the future to see how they'll impact the city, but also look at other compounding factors such as how land development's changed, how the marsh and ecology has changed and degraded over time, and then build an understanding of how flood hazards will be changed and then how it will impact the community. We use that to inform phase 2, which is looking at strategy sets one by one to understand how they can work to solve that problem. And then as we move to phase 3, again, it's pulling them back together to create an integrated solution and relating that back across the city's diverse geography. And now the city's in phase 4 and working to implement those strategies. This figure shows the city of Virginia Beach, and the blue arrows represent the flood pathways into the city for coastal floodwaters. There's a lot of arrows here, and we like to say this it's complicated. And Virginia Beach truly does have a very complicated flood hazard picture. We have flooding coming in from the Atlantic Ocean, from the Chesapeake Bay, from the Elizabeth River to the west, and from the south, the state of North Carolina, into what's called their Back Bay. Some things we want you to take away from this is, one, there's flood coming in from lots of directions, but fortunately for the city of Virginia Beach, a lot of their flood risk is within the city. So there's some opportunities to perhaps stop these floodwaters from entering and improve resilience to flooding in that way. There's also challenges in that these floodwaters go through adjacent communities and also from adjacent states. So we have to be careful in what we propose and make sure there's no adverse impacts on those communities, and work and partner with those communities to forward a solution. As we work to understand what the future will bring, we look to the NOAA federal sea level rise projections for how water levels will increase to the future. And this graph shows those projections from the year 2000 to 2100. What we want to get away from this is, there's a cone of uncertainty that reflects some different outcomes towards the future. And that can sometimes be a big challenge for communities to get their arms around, to set scenarios and to plan and take action against them. Fortunately, in this case, we took a middle of road type of approach and selected the intermediate curve, but it was also informed by several other information. In Hampton Roads area of Virginia and Virginia Beach itself, sea level rise is considered a fact, and that's supported by visual evidence, folks just seeing waters come up on their properties, observed increased instances of flooding like Mark showed earlier. And then we also have the long-term record, which was created by NOAA and folks at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science have analyzed. And in a similar graph that he showed earlier, we're looking at water level observations. We can see that it's not a linear trend, that the sea level rise is accelerating. And when those researchers project this out, we get scenarios very similar to what we've identified for our planning efforts here. So this gives us a lot of confidence in moving forward. We take those future condition scenarios and relate them to the existing water level conditions today. And it's important to look at a range of conditions, everything from daily high tides to nuisance floods to when a coastal flood advisory is issued, and then hurricane-driven storm surge, so we can see all the different types of ways the hazard will manifest itself in the future. We have 3 examples here that I'll just go through quick. And the first one on the left is just showing how frequent high tide and a nuisance flood might occur. And this is when some roads are flooded and we have flooding in people's yards. And today that might happen 4% of the year. In the middle of the century, about half of the year, we'll have those kind of conditions. And then towards the end of the century, almost all the time. So this paints a difficult picture that we have to wrap our heads around and plan against. In the middle, we're showing how the FEMA floodplain may change in the future. And the 3 colors represent the lightest one, today's condition, 1.5 and 3 feet of sea level rise. So this allows us to know what areas may be flooded in the future, and it informs land use and land development decisions and mitigation options. And then we want to see how frequent the large floods that really cause significant damage to the city, how their frequency might change. In this case, one example here is the 100-year flood that we often refer to in the FEMA world. Today, the odds of that occurring are 1 in 100, and that's how we get that 100-year nomenclature. If we look towards the future, towards that 3-foot scenario, the odds become 1 in 3 any given year. So this helps us understand we truly have to take some measures and steps to mitigate this kind of condition, or it will affect the economy and the quality of life in the city. We take information such as that and we can pull it into a geospatial framework. We can leverage individual building data from the city. We can leverage the value of those buildings from the tax assessor database, and we can pull that together and use flood loss economic models to estimate what's the true risk of these flood conditions and where does it exist beyond just looking at the floodplain. This map that we see in front of us shows the risk in dollars in what's called average annualized losses. So this is the loss that could occur any given year based on a range of conditions that could happen over time. And it helps us see where the risk is and where it's concentrated. It's a heat map. So in the red areas, that's where we have a lot of risk. And this helps us see where we can direct our efforts to mitigate this risk and buy it down in the future. We also want to pull these kind of numbers together community-wide to understand what's at stake and communicate that to the city stakeholders. And this graph on the right shows that today, any given year, the city is exposed to potentially $26 million of losses from storms that may happen across the range of conditions. That increases by 3 times towards the middle of the century and 12 times towards the end of the century. So that 12 times increase long term is truly the cost of doing nothing, and the losses, the disruption of the community and the quality of life, the degradation of that is what the city would like to avoid in the long term. It would truly make for a difficult picture. So how do we plan against that? We have a complex problem that requires a multifaceted solution. And what we have done is identified 4 layers or facets of strategies that we can pull together and apply together to try to buy that risk down. I'll go into these a little bit more in a moment, but I'll just give a quick overview now. So we have natural mitigations, and this is using nature-based features or preserving land or keeping development out of harm's way. Engineered defenses, which would be building flood walls and gates, et cetera. Adapted structures, which would be changing how the city designs and sites development. And finally, just prepared communities. One thing we'd like to note today is that when we first got into this effort over 5 years ago, there was a lot of focus on engineered defenses and how to protect almost all of the city from these kind of issues. As we've learned and progressed through the last 5 years, the conversations really broadened. And some of the first projects that will move towards implementation out of the study, and some of it's happening now, are looking at voluntary acquisition of very highly flood-prone, flood-loss properties and marsh restoration. So we'll talk quickly about natural mitigations. And here there's icons for a range of strategies that fall under this envelope, everything from beach nourishment and raising dunes to marsh restoration to moving some houses out of harm's way. We have a pictorial of a concept that we're looking to apply right now, which is marsh restoration using a technique called marsh terraces. And this is to close off an area of open water that's opened up over the years as sea level rise and additional waves, et cetera, have degraded that marsh and allowed additional water to flow through this area, and it has increased flooding. So this is a great example of the use of marsh restoration to close that pathway off a little bit more and reduce flooding. There's several engineered defense strategies, and we have two levels. The first one is what we term the citywide alternatives. And here we're using very high-level, robust level of protection in terms of storm surge barriers, levees, and seawalls to create opportunities to intervene in those flood pathways that we showed earlier so we can keep them from getting out of the city. The combination of these alternatives, we have 3 different variations of this, can protect from 28 to 45,000 homes within the city and reduce the amount of flooding from 45,000 to 45 to 85 square miles. At that great level of protection comes at great cost, and the cost of these range from $1 to $2.4 billion. So the costs are significant, and those are in today's dollars. The implementation of these strategies does take some time as they go through feasibility and design. So it's certainly a very expensive solution, but it does offer a lot of opportunity. Below that, we can use structures to just keep floodwaters from getting to some of the most highest risk and most vulnerable areas in the city. We call these our neighborhood level alternatives. While there's a lot of opportunity here, instead of protecting up to 45,000 structures, we're only protecting a few thousand structures and up to maybe 23 miles of reduced flooding square miles. The costs are much lower, from 10 to 70 million per project for a total of 185 million. Still a large cost, but much cheaper than the billion-dollar solutions. We also look at the existing developed environment and then how we can use some of our floodplain management practices and standards to reduce vulnerability and risk in the long term. And this is everything from keeping future development from these flood-prone areas to having higher standards to have additional freeboards, so to build buildings higher off the ground, to move critical facilities out of harm's way and elevate existing structures. And finally, prepared communities is just using the information gained in our knowledge gain, reaching out to the business community, to the public, helping them understand the issues, letting them know how to protect themselves, especially military, where we have a lot of service members coming into the area. They're renting homes, they don't know their exposure. How do we help them in the long term? As these strategies come together, we get a map such as shown on the right. And there's a lot going on here. We don't expect you to, we don't want to go through the whole thing today. We want to have 2 takeaways. And one, there's a lot of different ways to address this problem. They come together as an integrated solution, but it's complicated and you have to break it back apart as the city implements it and the different aspects of the city governments. We also want to emphasize that some of the strategies overlap. Here in the southern area, especially, we can have this red line represents a line of flood protection, but there's also opportunities to elevate or have voluntary acquisitions of homes behind that line of protection. So there's some decisions that have to be made and some further feasibility studies that have to be done. And what I'll do is turn it back over to Sue now. She'll talk about how the city is carrying this kind of vision forward to implementation.
Thank you, Brian. So how does the city take the great work that Dewberry has done and use it within the city? Next slide. On June 16th, the City Council adopted the Sea Level Rise Adaptation Strategy Report into the City Comprehensive Master Plan. The Public Works Design Standards were also adopted that day. Now we are looking for funding, feasibility studies, and long-term financial commitments for structures that will take years to develop and permit. The city is committed long-term, but has limited resources. Brian has talked about the costs associated with the engineering solutions, neighborhoods and adaptations, and mitigations. The city's strategy is to currently provide funding for the marsh restoration project under mitigation and for voluntary acquisition of structures that currently flood under the adaptation strategy. The city will conduct more research and analysis to stay up to date on the science and the engineering knowledge. Long-term projects will take commitments from state and federal governments to provide funding. Next slide. So how does the city integrate the strategies identified in this report? The city has the commitment and the leadership to initiate policy and planning changes, but we need to do more by making the changes to the building code and standards, changing to land use planning and zoning, and we have to continue with the community outreach, which is extremely important. Next slide. So integrating storm surge, the rising sea level, and increased rainfall, the master drainage study is ongoing. The Public Works Design Standards have been adopted. Public Works is continually working on the Stormwater Master Plan. Transportation is involved as roadways are critical infrastructure. As I stated before, Sea Level Rise has been incorporated into the comprehensive plan. Emergency management and the military community work with Public Works to make sure the sailors can get to their bases to do their jobs. And we work with the Strategic Growth Area Office and the state's coastal planning, keeping them involved and updated with the knowledge of what the Department of Public Works is doing. Next slide. We presented these findings to the city of Virginia Beach, citizens of Virginia Beach, through a series of public engagement meetings. They expressed preferences and priorities in response to possible flood mitigation actions, and their input helped to shape the city's strategies moving forward. Next slide. Although the city itself is very large, we partnered with all of these groups on the slide to make sure that our comprehensive sea level rise was inclusive and encompassing. Notice that the neighboring cities of Norfolk and Chesapeake and the state of North Carolina, we have nonprofits, universities, VDOT, and the military were all included and informed on the decision for Sea Level Rise report. This complex effort was shared with the community regionally, statewide, and nationally, learning from and sharing knowledge to perceive broader knowledge. As part of the $4 million we had for the sea level rise, NOAA deserves a big shout out for the $845,000 grant that they provided to the city. Next slide. I will conclude with these two statements. The city firmly believes that the cost of damage done by ignoring sea level rise will far exceed the cost of mitigation. Adopting higher standards will be more expensive, but keeping the same standards will increase risk. Either way, there is a cost. Next slide. If anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat box.
All right, Mark, I'll turn it back over to you. I think you had a slide for taking questions and answers.
Mark, I think you're muted.
How's that? Thank you. Sue, you touched on the idea that there were a series of storms that caught the public's attention and really kind of changed the dialogue within the community with regards to the severity of this challenge. Could you describe a little bit about the reality that Public Works Department may have been seeing issues of flooding due to sea level rise and rainfall, and but it hadn't really caught the public's attention. Can you talk a little bit about how the public dialogue and with the council members, their awareness of these issues went from not aware to somewhat aware to this actually being a priority for the community?
Yes. So we had a storm in early August, and then another one on Labor Day weekend, and then another one the second weekend, September, and then Hurricane Matthew in October. Hurricane Matthew dumped 12 to 15 inches on the interior of the city, and we had something like 4,500 homes flood. And they contacted City Hall. The citizens wanted to know why, if they're in the middle of the city, why we have flooding. And those 4 storms made a huge impact on how the citizens got behind the sea level rise and how they understand now what happened. And of course, you know, Public Works is understaffed as usual, and you know, we really realized that some of the ditches needed to be cleaned out. You know, there could have been a fallen tree that blocked some that would have caused additional flooding. But those 4 storms really made a big difference.
Mark, I'm not able to hear you, but you're not muted. Maybe try muting and then unmuting.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, yeah, great.
Thanks for the reminder. Again, one of the questions here is about the role that building codes play in this, and how do we see building codes advancing to incorporate changing risks from climate change? Let me take a quick swing at that, and then I'll pass it to Brian or Sue. They want to chime in. I'd say in general, as Brian's work outlines, there are just myriad options on how to address these challenges, and the local specifics are very important. In many cases, it makes sense to maybe realize that certain assets can't be moved but may still be under increasing risk. And these are areas where building codes can really make a difference. I think we as a country certainly learned after Hurricane Andrew in Florida in 92 or 95, that transformed the national building codes with respect to hurricane force winds. And we have seen success stories with respect to adaptation and adoption of modern standard building codes to stand up to extreme events. So I think really as a community are seeing the proof is in the pudding. The challenge is, of course, at the local level, establishing those standards and enforcing them. So, Brian, Sue, do you have notes from your perspectives on building codes specifically?
Well, what we have done is it is in our code that if it is a critical infrastructure, you know, a hospital, a roadway for evacuation, the fire department, those kind of things, if we build a new building, they have to be over the 3-foot sea level rise. So we are requiring them to build it to that capacity now. And that's one of the reasons that the sea level rise and the master drainage go hand in hand together, because we're developing all the models and we send those out. We send the 100-year storm out to everybody who requests it, and they cannot increase the flooding to upstream, downstream, or to adjacent neighbors, or we don't accept the project. Brian, you have anything else to say on that?
Yeah, I'll add a little bit. I think, with the question, I think the importance is for building codes, zoning, and design regulations to all, we're seeing it, gradually. I think there's been more of a uptake of it recently across communities across the country, but I think there's some better recognition coming online about the long-term risks of designing for today's conditions and building to today's conditions. So it's a critical thing to, there's different ways to do it, but to recognize where flooding will happen in the future, how much will happen, and how that will affect your community, your infrastructure, et cetera, and have some provisions in place to avoid those long-term losses and impacts to the community. One of Sue's colleagues has made a comment I'd like to share in regards to that. I think, he was talking about design of stormwater infrastructure and accommodating both future rainfall and sea level rise and how it functions for drainage. And we're designing for today at the end of its life cycle, 30, 40 years from now. His comment is we'd like to see it fail gracefully instead of fail catastrophically and cause a ton of flooding and issues in the community. And I think there needs to be just broader recognition of that when you're working in an environment where we see non-stationarity in our hazards. We see sea level coming up, and in some places rainfall is demonstrably increasing. You have to accommodate that in how you plan and design for your community.
Thanks. And I'd note for folks that want to dig in further to this, I would point them to great work being done by the Federal Alliance for Safe Homes, FLASH, as well as by the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, IBHS. Those are both great resources to dig further into that. Sue, there is a question here I'm going to pass to you. It is asking, has Virginia Beach ever worked with other regions around the country to learn from them? Or I would suggest to share to them and help teach them the journey that you've been on. But to what degree are you seeing the ability, the appetite to have dialogue from community to community or region to region on similarities of how to tackle these challenges?
Well, the word is definitely getting out. I don't think it was last week, it might have been the week before. We had a presentation that included on a private partnership that included Broward County in Florida. And they had taken and read our strategy and adopted some of that themselves. We had an email call from the University of Utah that had questions on what we were doing and how we were going. We put them toward our web page and asked them to read that before they determined which questions they wanted to ask. We did something like 47 presentations last year, and I think we're at 20 this year. And so we've been trying to get it out. And we also did the, what was Austin? Do you remember what Austin was? There was a presentation that we did for, I can't remember which one it was, but it was for Austin. So it was a nationwide presentation. So we're getting this out. We have, people who call us, it seems like on a daily basis, that want some information on this.
Okay. Thank you, Sue. There's a question here. I might take a first crack, and then Brian, I'll pass it to you. It's asking, how can smaller coastal communities or riverine communities, folks with fewer resources, how can they access data and resources to help build a resilient strategy for their community? As we noted, the cost to the city of Virginia Beach was $4 million for this study, which is a significant investment and reflects the economic engine that Virginia Beach is and the way that these hazards threaten that. I would say that for communities with fewer resources, this is a place where some of those federal screening tools and some of the publicly available tools can be useful to get towards the beginning of understanding of flood risk. And so certainly the tools and data from FEMA, but also I would note the NOAA's resources through our Digital Coast portal have a host of information that a non-expert user it's meant for that audience and can be browsed and examined to look at future exposure to flood risk along the coast. And I would also say that for smaller communities, there is an irreplaceable role for partnerships and local champions. That you need to have people that are banging the drum and aggregating energy and community discussion around these topics. That in and of itself is a really important ingredient that can sometimes lead to resources and the ability to tackle these problems with more detail. Brian, I know you work with a number of clients, not just City of Virginia Beach. Do you have insight on this question?
Sure. I would just offer, I agree with a lot of what you said there. There's a lot of tools out there from NOAA, especially grant opportunities from different federal organizations that help communities start walking down this path and learning more about it. You can do things on a larger or small scale. And there's a lot of initial steps you can do just in terms that are low cost, in terms of recognizing and looking at how flood risk will change that can inform planning, et cetera. I think that's, what I would share there. Yeah, we've done large to small ones, and I think it just depends on the detail that folks want to go into. There's a lot you can do with a little sometimes.
And we have about 3 minutes together, so maybe this might be our last question. And again, I might take a first crack, and then Sue, I'll pass it to you to see if there's an angle specific to Virginia Beach here that's relevant. But the question is touching on evaluation of how vulnerable populations are potentially impacted by natural hazards, including flooding. And are there aspects in this plan that seek to analyze and speak to potential disparity of exposure to risk? So I would say that this, of course, is a topic of national importance and has been emerging over the past maybe 15 years to take its rightful place alongside more of the scientific and macroeconomic impacts of flooding and natural hazards. And I'd be remiss not to note that our current national dialogue on race and social injustice, I think, is very effectively highlighting the idea that lasting resilience really at the end of the day reaches down to individuals and households and their ability to have agency to access resources and make decisions on their own behalf of how to deal with this risk. And so I think we are continuing to struggle forward as a country on maturing that piece of the discussion. And I am encouraged that we are progressing while acknowledging that we have so much further to go. So Sue, are there any angles of this that are relevant to touch on with respect to your study going on now?
Yes. Dewberry did a booklet for us on the social the social interactions of vulnerable populations, and that is on our website in the appendix for the sea level rise report. And what they did is they took the census data and they intersected that with our future floodplains to determine where our most vulnerable populations would be.
And Sue, Mark, I would just add that in terms of, social justice and how you move forward with strategies and everything else, there's cases, a lot of times, sometimes we want to focus on benefit cost ratio of some of these kind of, especially engineering strategies. And care was taken as we went through parts of the study effort to try where we were looking at, some social justice and trying to offer protection to some areas that may not have been, that actually lowered benefit cost ratio, but to offer more protection to a broader range of individuals so that, we could say we're not looking just to protect the most valuable real estate in the city, that we're really truly trying to do the best for the city as a whole.
Yeah, appreciate that, Brian. I would note your reference to benefit cost ratio is a key mechanic in terms of allocating federal spend across a whole number of agencies. And this topic, that the math of the benefit cost analysis is incomplete in that it does not fully account for
That's correct.
Social costs. It does not fully account for environmental services and ecosystem function. And so that is certainly a known and exacerbating problem that is a topic of discussion very frequently within the federal family about how we administer our grant programs and all of the mechanics that are involved with executing towards the public trust. And again, that might not have been such a robust discussion a decade ago. And so while frustrated with the pace of change, I am encouraged that it is increasingly part of the dialogue and central to it. So with that, I see us at the end of our time. I'd really like to thank Sue and Brian for joining me and sharing their story from the front lines about how federal investments in science and information can help provide a foundation for local community resilience in partnership with private industry. And I'd also like to thank the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation for inviting us to convene this morning and spend the time together. Thank you all for spending part of your day with us, and hope you have a great day, great week ahead. Take care.